Hello, welcome to Wyvern Minis. Now today I'm continuing my quest to paint all of my own 3D printed models for my Heroquest set. I'm replacing all the things in the box because I prefer these sculpts and they're not bendy plastic and all that sort of stuff, and it's just an interesting challenge to make my own personalised set. So today I'm painting up the heroes from the base set, and you can see here I've got various heroes. Not just the four, because I've decided to do male and female versions of all of them. I've also got a couple of alternatives. There's an alternative Barbarian who looks cool but takes up a lot of space, and an alternative old wizard, because you don't want to be ageist, do you? So if you've seen some of my other Heroquest videos, then the painting process is going to be familiar to you. If you haven't, feel free to go check them out after this video. There's a link down below to the playlist where they're all stored. I'm making good progress on getting the core set all painted up, and then I'll be working on the expansions as well. But basically I'm starting with a black spray and then a light sort of zenithal spray with wraithbone, so I can use a kind of sort of slapchoppy type method on them. And here, you know, as an example of some of the models that I found, they're all sourced from different places. I'll put links below, but that's an old school style wizard. I decided to print out this old wizard as well. Looks a bit more Gandalf-like, and a female wizard there. I wanted to make sure they had female versions because my daughter really likes playing the game, as does my wife, and my youngest daughter, I'm sure she'll play it when she gets a little bit older. So I wanted to give them the option of playing any of the characters as girls if they wanted to, and I found some really nice sculpts for them. When it came to painting the mobs of bad guys, like the abominations I painted or the orcs and goblins, it was a lot easier to batch paint them because there were a lot of more similar colours. I did some variation on the tunics of the goblins just to make it interesting, but I kind of repeated the same colour a few times across the different models, and the abominations are all the same colour as each other, so batch painting is very quick. Here I've got a decent batch of 10 models, but I wanted to make sure all the heroes looked individual. So that does mean, there are certain things like skin tones you could replicate, and if you've got bits of leather, try to replicate doing the same bits of leather across different models at the same time. But I wanted to make them look individual, so it was a bit more difficult to do it really quickly. I think my top tip for doing them quickly is just painting a colour on one model and set it aside, and while it dries you're painting another colour on another model. That's kind of the best you can do when you've got an eclectic collection of heroes like this. I think trying to decide on the colours to use is almost the hardest bit here. I mean, remember the old days of Games Workshop where everything was red? I definitely did that when I was a kid, painted everything red, and I still think it looks good, but I wanted to not do that here. So, choosing a nice sort of pink for the dress on the female sorceress, I think that looked really good. And trying to pick some different colours, so it's quite obvious which miniature is which to me, but I wanted to make sure it was definitely obvious for the kids. So when they picked one up, there was no doubt that this was a barbarian and this was a dwarf, and I didn't necessarily want to paint both dwarfs in the same colour, because they're individuals, and I think it looks nice, but essentially it's just using contrast paints here, sometimes slightly thinned down with a little bit of water, doing them off the wet palette, sometimes straight out of the pot. Just depends on the colour, depends on how saturated you want it to look. Sometimes it needs an extra coat, you just have to play it by ear. There's no great secret to doing this. If you've done the zenithal spray, or if you've done a proper slapchop method where you're dry brushing grey and then white on top of black, then you've already got shadows built into the undercoat essentially, and you can just let the contrast paint or the speed paint, whatever you're using, just let it do its thing, and you end up with getting darker in the recesses and lighter on the highlights. It's quite nice and easy and quick, and the only thing to watch out for is try not to go over onto the wrong bits, because you have to reapply a base colour to be able to then do the contrast paint on top. Some of the more opaque and darker contrast paints will go nicely over other ones, sometimes you get an interesting effect because it kind of blends it together a little bit, and sometimes it will just go over it and cover it because it's more opaque. But generally, especially with the light colours, if you go over onto the wrong bit, you are going to have to reapply a bit of Wraithbone to be able to correct, which is something that you don't necessarily need to do when you're using just regular acrylic paints. But that's the only thing to watch out for. And I just went around trying to make them look quite natural, trying not to go too nuts on the colours on each one, trying to keep them to each model has quite a limited palette of colours, so they look like a kind of cohesive model that is wearing clothes that it might have actually picked up in the morning before it went adventuring. But yeah, no hard and fast rules as far as picking them. I just picked whatever I thought looked good at the time. I particularly liked the teal head crest on the female dwarf. I thought that looked really nice, and it was quite close to the blue that I did for the jerkin on the male dwarf. And then her shield, that's a nice little tip. Painted the shield silver first and then used contrast paints on top of it, and you get a nice kind of shiny metallic colour coming out of that. The red and the blue, a little bit Captain America like, which wasn't initially intentional, but then I did recognise what I was doing as I was doing it. But I thought it looked fine, so I carried on with it. I also like the elves. I wanted the elves to look kind of like wood elves, but not just everything green, so I used quite a lot of grey in there, and I thought that's quite good because they're melting into the shadows of a forest or whatever. Made it look more like maybe they're ready for adventuring in a dungeon as opposed to walking through a forest. Particularly the male elf with his grey cloak, which I thought looked quite similar to the grey cloaks from the Lord of the Rings. But the female elf, she's got a very kind of leafy cloak on, so I did that in green, but did her underclothes in a kind of brownish grey kind of colour, which I thought looked really natural and nice. And that's the character my daughter uses primarily, so she's happy with the colour choice on that, which is the main thing. So after the main colours are blocked in on the miniatures, the next step for the miniatures would be washing them, but prior to that I do the bases, or at least the first couple of stages of the bases. Now this is the same method I've used on all the other Heroquest miniatures. I'm using the same flagstone bases. It kind of ties everything together, makes it look like they're all belong in the same game, they're walking through the same dungeon. I've got another video that I did recently which goes into a bit more detail on painting these flagstone bases. It's not overly complicated, but you can see it more clearly on that other video if you want to click on the link below. So in brief, it's slapping basilicanum grey contrast paint all over the base, and then a light dry brush with dawnstone to kind of just tidy that up a bit and where it pools a little bit on the flat surfaces, make it look a bit smoother. And then after the wash of the entire model, doing a light dry brush with grey cere, which just brightens up the stone a bit, makes it look nice. And you can kind of vary that slightly, so some of the stones look a bit lighter than other stones, which gives just a very subtle variation. I didn't want it to be complicated or take a long time, and I think this is a really nice kind of compromise with getting enough detail in there that it looks good, but not taking a long time at all. And then it's just doing a black rim to the base, so that it just kind of finishes it off nicely, I think. Now at this point I added an extra stage, which was to tidy up some of the skin tones. I felt that the contrast paint had gone a bit too dark in a few places, and I wasn't too happy with it, so I went through and just used a bit of regular acrylic paints, base paints and layer paints from Citadel to just highlight the skin a little bit and bring up that flesh tone. Different ones for different races, slightly more ruddy kind of Bugman's glow on the dwarfs, which end up looking really cool. Quite a weather-beaten sort of tone for the Barbarians, and a nice pale one for the elf flesh. This isn't always going to be necessary, but I just felt like it was a nice little thing to add in, even though these models are not intended for winning competitions or looking at too closely. They're for tabletop use, so as long as they look good from 3 feet away on the table, then I'm happy. But I thought it just needed a little bit of an elevation on you know, the hands and the faces really, because that's some of the focal points of the models. These heroes are almost complete and ready for the tabletop. This stage is just washing them with Army Painter Strong Tone all over the miniature and the base, the whole thing. Army Painter also do a dark tone which is closer to black and a soft tone which is a lighter brown colour. I find the Strong Tone is an ideal kind of mid-range wash. Really adds a lot of warmth to the model, gets in those recesses, adds a lot of depth, and ties the colours together. You'll have seen me use it in lots of my videos if you've been watching the channel for any length of time. So it's just slapping it all on. I water it down roughly 50-50 with water, slap it all over the entire model. And what this sort of highlights, I think, is the previous stage I was doing some sort of highlights on top of the slapchop kind of method, on top of the contrast paint, and here I'm putting a wash on it. So I think bear in mind that speed paints and contrast paints are just another part of your toolbox really. They're not something completely different and alien. You can still do highlighting and washing and blending and glazing and whatever you want with them. They're just a useful thing, which speeds up some parts of painting and makes other parts sometimes more challenging, like I said earlier about having to add the base coat again to correct any mistakes. You do need to watch out in this stage for the wash pooling a bit too much. You might need to use a dry brush or a bit of paper towel or something to soak up a little bit of the wash if it's pooling somewhere you don't want it to be. But generally I find if it's nicely thinned down, it will sit quite nicely. It just takes ages to dry. So do this stage, leave it overnight and come back and do the final bit in the morning, which is doing the base rims. I like doing black base rims at the moment. It used to be Goblin Green. I know that a lot of people like brown base rims, but for me the black is a nice neutral kind of colour. It fits in with any game mat you want to be using for your games, and just kind of finishes it off nicely, I think. And then I spray varnish the models with Minotaur and varnish from Games Workshop, making sure it is very, very well shaken up, and not doing it when it's too wet, because sometimes you get a frosting effect. But as long as you're doing it in a nice warm environment and the can is well shook, then it should be fine. And they're all done. I'm really pleased with how these came out. From this kind of distance, on a tabletop, they look spot on. It's really nice playing the game with fully painted models. Makes a difference to just having the coloured plastic. But yeah, these came out just how I wanted, really. I mean, I had no plan, like I said earlier, but they've ended up looking, yeah, just right for me. So I'm really pleased. As I said, my daughter tends to play the elf, so I wanted to make sure that was right. I really like the muted colours of both the elves I've done here. The little red kind of undershirt on the female elf just pops a little bit, which I think is really cool. I love both these dwarf characters. They look so stoic and strong. The blue for the male and the teal for the female, I think just works next to each other. I couldn't decide whether I wanted a bearded Gandalf type wizard or one of the old school wizards like the old Heroquest, so I did them both. And that female wizard, she's kind of elfy, but she looks pretty cool. And these Barbarians, the two males are from Avatars of War, and the female looks like she's straight out of Skyrim, which I think is a real strong kind of look. So that's really cool. Altogether, I think they look really good. The only problem with this kind of close-up photography is that it can highlight some things that you don't notice so much when it's on the tabletop. And I was definitely seeing that on the cloaks, in particular on these wizards. There's a little bit of a graininess when you're using these very zoomed in photographs. I think that might be due to spraying them in not ideal conditions and then using thin contrast paints. It kind of lets that through. I find it slightly annoying, not annoying enough to do anything about it other than make sure when I'm spraying in the future I'm a bit more careful. But you really don't notice it on the tabletop, but it's something to bear in mind. I mean, these miniatures are not for display, they're for playing with, but it's still a little bit unfortunate that you see these little things come through when you do these close-in macro photography type things. But yeah, on my Deepcut Studios mat, which I've done a review of in another video, they look great and they fit in fighting against the various monsters that I've painted as well. I'm really pleased with the overall look. One of the things to bear in mind is having models that fit inside the 25mm squares. So that's why I did the 2 Barbarians, because one of them looks like he's Arnie being Conan in Conan the Barbarian. He's got his swinging sword which pokes out a long way from his square. So then the more stoic one standing on his sword looks more like Conan from the books, I think. I painted them both with black hair, so they're both book Conan appropriate. But you know, the one that's leaning on his sword is not poking out from his square, so it fits in better. And that's one of the things to bear in mind. It's a bit like when you're trying to make a regiment in old school fantasy work, and things have to rank up without knocking each other over. You quickly find that rooms fill up in Heroquest, so it's worth bearing in mind. You don't want things that are poking out too much here and there. But anyway, that's my heroes. Very pleased with how they came out. Didn't take too long to do. Like I said, batch painting is a little bit more difficult with these sort of models where they're wearing different clothes. But it's the same process as I've used for the other monsters. So if you like that, check out the rest of the videos that I've been doing on Heroquest. I've got some more in the works to finish off the core set. Gargoyles, skeletons and furniture, I think, are the main things I need to finish off. And then I'll be on to the expansions, which I've already started printing bits and pieces out for. So stay tuned, and it'd be good to see you back again. Hit the old subscribe button and you'll get notified when the next video comes out. Alright, cheers, bye.